Good afternoon. I'm Kim T. Ha, Director of the Pennington Public Library. Thank you for joining us for this special event, the kickoff to Pennington Public Library's third NEA Big Read, in conversation with author Daniel Mendelsohn. If you have any questions during the program, please write them in the Q&A section for our Q&A at the end. Otherwise, please feel free to comment in the chat window, as many of you are doing now. The NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. This initiative aims to inspire meaningful conversations, celebrate local creativity, elevate a wide variety of voices and perspectives, and build stronger connections in communities. The Big Read broadens our understanding of ourselves and our neighbors through the power of a shared reading experience. This year, we've chosen Circe by Madeline Miller as our Big Read title. We're also highlighting a number of related companion titles, including An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic. So we're thrilled to be hosting Daniel Mendelsohn today. There are actually two special individuals I would like to introduce today. In addition to Daniel, I would also like to provide some background on my co-facilitator, Reverend Dr. Gordon S. Mikoski. Reverend Dr. Mikoski, Associate Professor of Christian Education, earned his MDiv and MA degrees from the Princeton Theological Seminary and his Ph.D. from Emory University. His research and teaching interests focus on Christian education, the sacraments, the doctrine of the Trinity, and practical theology. During the season of Lent for the past 9 years, Reverend Dr. Mikoski has taught courses on classical literature from biblical perspective. In the first 6 years, he taught every one of Shakespeare's 38 plays. For the past 3 years, he has focused on Homer and Virgil. This year's focus will be on Dante's Divine Comedy. His wife, the Reverend Nancy Mikoski, serves as pastor of our local Pennington Presbyterian Church. Welcome, Gordon. Thank you for being with us today. And now on to information about our featured guest. Daniel Mendelsohn is an internationally best-selling author, critic, essayist, and translator. Born in New York City, he received degrees in classics from the University of Virginia and Princeton. After completing his Ph.D., he moved to New York City, where he began freelance writing full-time. Since 1991, he has been a prolific contributor of essays, reviews, and articles to many publications, most frequently The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. In February 2019, he was named editor-at-large of the New York Review of Books and the director of the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, a charitable trust that supports writers of nonfiction, essay, and criticism. Mendelsohn's books, of course, include An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, named a Best Book of the Year by NPR, Newsday, Library Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and Kirkus. The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million in 2006, which won the National Books Critics Circle Award and the National Jewish Book Award in the United States and the Medici Prize in France. And a memoir, The Elusive Embrace, 1999, a Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year. His 10th book, 3 Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate, September 2020, was recognized as a Best Book of the Year by Kirkus and Literary Hub and received the Best Foreign Book Prize 2020 in France. Daniel Mendelsohn's honors include many. They include the American Academy of Arts and Letters Harry Versailles Prize for Prose Style, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Barnes & Noble Discover Prize, the NBCC Citation for Excellence in Book Reviewing, the George Jean Nathan Prize for Drama Criticism, and Princeton University's James Madison Medal. A member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Association, Mendelsohn sits on the board of the American Council of Learned Societies and teaches literature at Bard College. It is my great pleasure to introduce Daniel Mendelsohn. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. I am starting my video. Here I am.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Daniel, you wanted to open by talking a little bit about your writing.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. And I'm so much looking forward to Gordon, whom I now understand we shared our graduate school experiences both in Princeton. So where everyone is from is territory that is well known for me. I lived in the area for 8 years, actually, before I moved back to New York. So it's nice to be back in friendly territory, so to speak. So the book, An Odyssey, began for many years since I started writing in the early 1990s, when I was still in graduate school, actually, at Princeton, but I had begun freelance writing. And because my background was in classics, it was always very interesting for me to try to sort of present material about classical Greece, Greek literature, mythology, history to a wider audience. And at a certain point in completing my Ph.D., I decided that that was going to be much more exciting for me than remaining in the academic world. And so actually I finished my PhD, moved to New York, and started writing lots of book reviews, theater reviews, essays for different magazines and newspapers. But I was sort of like, dial a classicist. Whenever a book came out about the classics or a new translation of Homer or the Aeneid or what have you, an editor would call me and ask me if I couldn't write something about it because I had that background. And so, it's always been a sort of mainstay of my writing career to be presenting material that can be technical and a little bit recherche about the Greek and Roman classics, but in a way that, smart, ordinary readers who don't have that background can relate to. And that's been sort of my profile for the past 30-something years at this point. The An Odyssey started, as having read it, with my father calling me in the winter of 2011. I also teach classics at Bard College here in the Hudson Valley, which is where I am right now. And I was about to do a freshman seminar on the Odyssey. And my dad called me one night and he said, "Oh, well, I would really like to take your course." So what do you say? And I remember thinking at the outset, this could be really funny. It's a setup of a sitcom, basically. A middle-aged college professor suddenly has to deal with his curmudgeonly father being his student. And in fact, so my dad and I talked about it, and he lived on Long Island. And so it's quite a trip from Long Island up to where Bard is in the Hudson Valley. Whether you drive or whether you take 2 trains, it's over 3 hours. So it was quite a commitment on his part. But he decided he wanted to do it for reasons that I did not fully understand at the time, I think it's safe to say. And I actually called my editor at the New Yorker and I said, by the end of the semester, I might have a very funny personal history piece for you, because there's a rubric of essays for the New Yorker called Personal History. And I just thought it would be a sort of comic piece. And obviously there is some of that in the book. There's this tension between me and my father, who suddenly decides that he's a great authority on Homer and starts telling me why I'm wrong about the Odyssey and blah, blah, blah. But, as you also know from reading the book, the experience deepened over time in different ways. And one of the things that happened, so I felt I was getting to know my father through his reactions to the reading, and things about him that were not necessarily just comical. And then, as you know, towards the end of the semester, I was on the phone talking to my Princeton dissertation advisor, a very great scholar of the classics called Froma Zeitlin, who's a very close friend of mine. And I had been telling her all semester, about this experience with my father. And she called me in May and said, you know, she had just been reading about this cruise that reproduces the voyages of Odysseus. And she said, you know, you should really do this with your father. So I called my dad, and kind of incredibly to me, he said he wanted to do it. So then we went on the cruise, and that added a whole other dimension of intensity to the experience for the reasons that I explain in the book. You know, I really began to see sides of my father that really had not been known to me in certain respects. And then a few months after we returned in the autumn of 2011, he fell ill, had an accident, and that just sort of precipitated a series of things that ended with him having this massive stroke in January of 2012, and he died a few months later. And so it was what I began by thinking would be a sort of a cute little essay. I realized after he died that, which was now a year since he took the class, that in different ways, the whole last year of his life had been filtered through the Odyssey in one way or the other. And that's when I thought, this can be a book. And so the rest, you know, and then I started working on it. You know, once I had the sort of the whole thing in the rearview mirror, so to speak, I understood that there was a shape to the story that arced from the classroom to the hospital, basically. So that's how it all came to be.
Wow. Daniel, the book is very interestingly structured, but it was not always structured that way. In Three Rings, you mentioned how you had it written in three distinct parts: the classroom, the trip, right, and what was the third part? It was like
A
three
hospital,
parts.
yeah.
The hospital, yes. So, but it didn't seem to work out in your mind, or you sought advice on how to make it work. Could
Yeah.
you expand on that process?
Yeah, it was very interesting. So in fact, it was so interesting that I ended up writing another book about how I had struggled writing the Odyssey book, because it gave me a lot of insights into storytelling, which turned out to be about actually how Homer tells his stories. So I wrote the book, and I think I guess I started in the end of 2012, about 6 or 7 months after Dad died. And I remember I wrote the first, I don't know, maybe 20 pages. And then I worked on it for the next few years. And I think by the end of 2015, maybe summer of 2015, I had like a 600-page manuscript, but I knew, because I am a book critic as well as a writer, it was not working. There was something dead on the page. And I had written these three sections sort of in the order I just told the story. So first you get the classroom, then we go on the cruise, and then my father gets sick and dies. And I finally went to one of my closest friends who died actually last summer in his early 90s, a very renowned editor called Robert Gottlieb, who actually had been the editor of the New Yorker, as well as several publishing companies. And he read through the manuscript and he said, I know it's wrong. He said, you're telling everything in the order it happened. And he said, the problem is by the time you get to the end of part one, which traces the classroom experience from January to May, the semester, he says, you don't want to go on a cruise at that point because it's the end of a narrative, right? You don't want to have one narrative after the other, each one a sort of discrete chunk. He said, you have to think of a way to take the stuff that's in the cruise part and then in the illness and hospital part and wind them around the classroom part so that the backbone, the spine of the narrative is teaching these young kids and my elderly father the Odyssey from January to May. But he said you can use flashbacks, flash forwards, but he said you can sort of take parts of what would happen on the cruise and import them into the part of the class where you're explaining about the voyages of Ulysses, of Odysseus. So, and then as soon as he said that, I sort of had one of those, duh, kind of stupid me moments, because of course this technique of kind of entwining different narratives, in a kind of double helix almost, where one narrative or even two narratives circles around a main narrative, is exactly the way Homer narrates the Odyssey. So, the answer to my structural problem had been staring me in the face the whole time. And the minute Bob told me that, I knew exactly how to do it. Like it literally took me just maybe a month to sort of disassemble the original version and reconstruct it in the version, that eventually was published. And then later on, I had to give a series of lectures because you, Kim, had mentioned my subsequent book called Three Rings. So this kind of narrative is what classicists call ring composition, because it moves like that rather than like that. And I had been asked to give a series of lectures by my alma mater, University of Virginia, my undergraduate alma mater, on whatever subject I wanted. And I thought this would be a really fun thing to talk about, is just how writers think about shaping their stories, basically. And so I ended up writing Three Rings, which begins with me describing the sort of, let's call it the narrative crisis that I experienced when writing An Odyssey. And that was the sort of kickoff for that book. It was a sort of an interesting way to think about different ways of telling a story. And sometimes the least straightforward way is the most interesting. At least I hope so. So that's how that all happened.
Well, I have a question that kind of follows up on that. I wonder if this is what makes a classic text. It's hard to know from reading the book, An Odyssey, whether your life illuminates Homer or Homer illuminates your life. And it seems like it's kind of a perpetual braiding or interplay.
Yeah.
And maybe you could just comment on that a little bit more in terms of, we never just read a text and see what, we don't live in 1200 BC or 800 BC, right? And we're Americans, we bring ourselves to that and our agendas. But on the other hand, the text somehow speaks into our world. And is that what a classic is? Is this capacity for interweaving of our lives and this text's narrative, that we keep finding new things in it and in us?
Well, I think that has to be the case, Gordon. I think it was the Italian writer Italo Calvino who said a classic is a book that never stops having something to say to us. And the reason that certain books, which we will call classics, never stop having something to say to us is that human nature doesn't change. The gadgets get better, but human nature remains pretty constant. And so you take the Odyssey, which is a product of a civilization, that dates to 2,700 years ago. Virtually all of the ephemeral stuff has changed since then. The way that people think about innumerable subjects, the technology, everything is different, except certain things aren't different. The relationship between husbands and wives, between fathers and sons, that's the kind of thing. And so one of the, you began, Gordon, by saying, well, am I reading the Odyssey or is the Odyssey reading me, so to speak, basically? And I think when you really encounter a great work, both of those things are true. So you read the book and you think, with all the variables, explained, the clothes, the iPhones, the whatever, you're like, that's something I recognize, you know, a big part of the Odyssey, for example. So if you went out onto the street and you asked some random person, you know, what is the Odyssey about? What most people know, you know, is that it's about this guy who's been away at war for a very long time and he's trying to get back to his wife, which is true. But one thing I became intently aware of, I sort of knew it intellectually, but I didn't really absorb it emotionally until my father was sitting in the classroom, is that a lot of the Odyssey, and possibly more of the Odyssey, just in terms of real estate, is devoted to fathers and sons. Odysseus's relationship to his young son Telemachus, who's just coming of age and trying to figure out how to be a grown-up, but he's never had a father around to teach him. And also Odysseus's relationship with his own father, whom he left 20 years ago and is now a decrepit elderly man who's desperately unhappy because he thinks his son is dead. And so that's the stuff that speaks to us. You know, yes, so many of the things described in the Odyssey are unrecognizable to modern people. But when you sort of sweep that stuff away, it's about recognizable human situations and also problems. You know, the Odyssey raises very interesting questions, which my father, because he was 60 years older than every other student in the class, had experience of, which they couldn't know about, which is, you know, and we know as adults, right? You know, what does it mean to be separated from someone that you love for a very long time? You know, Odysseus is separated from Penelope for 20 years. These kids were 19 years old. Like, they couldn't even imagine 20 years because they hadn't even lived 20 years. So for them, it's sort of hypothetical. But I remember my father at one point intervening towards the end of the class. So, you know, the other thing the Odyssey asks, and this is a very profound question that I think is both emotional and intellectual, and even metaphysical maybe, which is, you know, when he gets back, finally, after 20 years, he has to be in disguise because he doesn't know if people want to kill him, which is in fact the case. And there's a sort of climactic moment when he and his wife, whom he hasn't seen in 20 years, have to sort of reveal themselves, you know, each has to reveal themselves to the other. And it raises a really interesting question, which is, A, how do you know who someone is? Right? That's a fundamental and very profound, you know, and especially I think at the time of the Odyssey, you know, when there's no driver's license, credit cards, you know, all the, like, how do you prove that you are who you say you are? And also because time changes you. Right. So in a way, the sort of paradox of the Odyssey, and all of us who are, you know, getting on in years deal with this all the time, right, is that on the one hand, we feel that we are a constant, right? We are always ourselves to us. But on the other hand, we obviously change over time. So how do you reconcile those things? And I think the paradox of the Odyssey is he has to prove that he was the same person who went away. But of course, there's no way he can be the same person who went away because he's been changed by his experiences and his sufferings, just as she has been. And these are all very profound questions that I think we all experience, you know, especially as we age. And anyway, just to get back to this moment, so we were talking about this in the classroom on the day we were discussing the big climactic recognition scene, because in the end, Penelope tricks Odysseus into saying something that proves that he really is Odysseus, because it's a piece of information that nobody else can know. And my father and the students sort of weren't getting it because basically they were too young. You know, they just haven't been through this. And my father said, I know what it's like to be with someone so long that you get to a point where they don't look anything like the person you started out with, and yet you know it's still them. And I thought that was very moving, really. You know, so these are real life kinds of things that Homer is interested in. And that's why these books speak to us at the end of the day. They have to be. It has to be the case that that's why we read them, you know.
Yeah. Daniel, you mentioned a lot about the themes, and here you just mentioned it as well, the theme of identity in the Odyssey.
Mhm.
How do you think this theme applies to our modern world now, where people can be both incredibly open about their personal views online, yet they can express themselves in complete anonymity behind their social media handles?
Well, I think, that's actually, Kim, I'm going to thank you for giving me an insight, which I didn't have, but it would be an interesting thing to add the next time I teach the Odyssey, which is that maneuvering between a sort of a public persona and a sort of a true self and an anonymized self is exactly what Odysseus has to keep doing. And in fact, as I explain in the book at one point, there's a Greek pronoun which means no one, nobody, which is outis, which sort of sounds like the way you might say Odysseus if you've had a few drinks. And there's a sort of a constant wink going on through the epic about Odysseus as, on the one hand, the famous hero of the Trojan War. Excuse me, I'm just going to move because the sun is right in my eyes. Odysseus is the world famous hero of the Trojan War. Everywhere he goes, people are talking about the Trojan War and his role in it. Remember, it just ended when the Odyssey is taking place. It's a recent event. And on the other hand, the fact that he's a nobody, he's lost at sea. Everyone thinks he's dead. He's off the map, right? And I do think that's something that we deal with too, right? Which is this, we have different selves in different environments. And I think nowhere more so than now. We are, but that's why I love the Odyssey. It's another reason I love the Odyssey, which is, this is, Odysseus is many things to many people. He has all different personas depending on who he's talking about. And we all do that, actually. You're not the same with your spouse the way you are with your colleagues, and you're not the same with your colleagues the way you are with your children, right? So we're all composed of many identities, actually. And I think that's the central interest of the Odyssey. One of the interesting things about Odysseus as a protagonist is, he's a trickster, right? He's a great liar. He's great at disguises. So it sort of further complicates this question of identity if your main character is someone who's very good at pretending to be somebody else, But I think these are all very, I would also say that, in our contemporary world where, let's call it fluidity of one kind or another, whether it's gender or anything else, is much more prominent in people's thinking than it used to be. I also think the Odyssey is the sort of the great master text for that subject. This is about a person who moves between identities very easily. So in that sense, to come back to the original question, this is why we're interested in these texts. It's not like medicine that you have to take because it's good for you. It says true things about our experience as human beings in a very artful and engaging way. What's not to love?
A lot of people do see it as medicine that they have to take in high school. You're subjected to this, usually the Odyssey, not always the Iliad. And then you forget it, you get through it, and then you don't pick it up again. And now as an adult, you think, I don't know, maybe I should read that. And I was interested in your opening comments where you described yourself, essentially in my terms, as a public scholar, right? You're addressing the public, not academia per se. It strikes me that An Odyssey does that. It opens up the Odyssey for people and helps build bridges to connect with it. Circe does as well, the novel. But they're two very different approaches to helping people to connect with some of what you've just been saying so eloquently. I noticed in your book, you said you even had your own kind of fan fiction episode with Circe. and telling stories on the way to school when you're driving your kids. And
Yeah. Well,
um,
my boys were going to Princeton Academy whenever that was 15 years ago, more than that, actually. I used to drive from our house in Trenton. And so it's about a 25-minute drive. And I don't know, a lot of fairy tales and children's tales, but I do know the Odyssey. So I would keep sort of Baudelarizing the Odyssey and telling the kids these sort of G-rated versions of different stories with all the sex and violence taken out, basically, which doesn't leave that much, actually. And I remember when Peter, my older boy, was in high school, I guess, in Pennsylvania. And he called me one day and he said, like, we're reading the Odyssey in English, and it's nothing like what you used to tell us on the way to the, Princeton Academy. I was like, oh, yeah, but I would tell them different versions of that, which of course is a very, making up your own version, which is something that I'm doing in one way in my book. It's something Madeline is doing in a different way in her book. And in fact, many, particularly female authors right now, there's been a huge outpouring of adaptations of Greek myth, Homer, other writers, told from the points of view of female characters who are sort of marginal in the original text, but become the heroines, the protagonists of these new texts. And to do that is actually a very Greek thing to do. The Greeks didn't have official versions of things. That's a sort of a more modern concept. There was no Edith Hamilton's, Greek myths for the Greeks. They had these stories. They were always circulating. Different poets told them. Different poets told different versions. Different poets and playwrights, later on playwrights during the age of Greek tragedy, would do exactly the same thing. So, for example, a famous play by Euripides, produced in 415 BC, called The Trojan Women, which is often performed on stage today as an anti-war play, is Euripides imagining the Trojan War told from the point of the women of the defeated side, right? So already in ancient times, they're adapting, riffing the classics, right? And so what's going on now is just really taking a leaf from what the ancients themselves did, which is to always be playing with these stories and adapting them and using them for one's own artistic purpose. I think it's great. I think it's super. And it just shows, again, that these tales, for whatever reason, have incredible staying power. They're very elastic.
That's kind of my question. Could you assess the two different approaches briefly, like pluses and minuses? You take what I would call an interleaving approach, your life and the text, but Madeline Miller takes more of, for lack of a better term, a fan fiction approach, where she takes the story and then develops a new story, kind of riffing on it. Those are two overlapping, but they're kind of different.
Well, because
strength and weakness.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Gordon. I mean, to some extent, it's a difference between nonfiction and fiction. I mean, hers is a work of fiction where she gets to play with, there's a certain amount of material about Circe in the classical tradition, not just in the Odyssey. And she takes that and then she spins a tale out of it. I'm working with the actual, I'm trying to bring across. So her book is not about the Odyssey. It's taking a leaf from the Odyssey and sort of running with it. But based on, Madeline has studied classics seriously. So it's based on, real data about the mythic tradition, so to speak. I'm doing something different, which I've done in other books as well, which is sort of intertwine a personal narrative, in this case, how I learned a lot about my father by reading the Odyssey with him, with a kind of, let's call it a literary critical analysis, where I actually sit down and talk about the Odyssey and examine different parts of the Odyssey. So it's a completely different kind of book, but they're both I would say, informed both my book and Madeline's book by a kind of an eagerness to bring across to a wide public our love of this literary tradition and these works, which we feel have a lot to say, you know.
Daniel, I'm going to bring it back to your journey in writing the Odyssey, or An Odyssey, rather. You mentioned a lot about trying to learn more about your father through this journey of writing An Odyssey. And, we learn with you all of these different discoveries about your father, which you hadn't learned before.
Mhm.
How did writing An Odyssey change your perspective of your father and his identity?
Well, I mean, the whole experience was, I mean, there were things I thought I knew about my father, let's put it this way, which were confirmed by his reactions to reading the Odyssey, which, for those of you who haven't read it yet, he did not like. The punchline of the book is that after a semester, I could not persuade him to like the Odyssey because he didn't like Odysseus. And one reason I privately think he didn't like Odysseus is that Odysseus, who's my father was a sort of straight arrow kind of a guy. And Odysseus is a trickster, a liar, he tells tall tales. He's an incredible manipulator of people, all the things my father doesn't like, And I must say, I think, I can say this now, Odysseus reminded my father of his father-in-law, my mother's father, who was very much of a kind of romantic, swaggering trickster type, always with a trick up his sleeve. And so his reaction to the text, on the one hand, confirmed, it wasn't a surprise to me that he was so hostile from the very beginning to Odysseus as a character. It becomes a kind of comic leitmotif of the book. He's always interrupting me and telling me how terrible Odysseus is. Of course, if you're a writer, writers love Odysseus because he's basically a kind of proto-writer. He's just making up stories as he goes along to serve his purposes, so we think he's great. But my dad, as you know, is a mathematician. He was a science guy, and he wanted everything to be four square. On the other hand, I saw elements of my dad's personality as part of this experience, which I hadn't really guessed at. Or at least I think I saw parts of him that, for whatever reason, had never had an opportunity to kind of flourish and expand in his lifetime. And that really came out on the cruise, when we were on this 10-day Odyssey cruise, schlepping all over the Mediterranean. And he was so, he was a kind of a tight person in a lot of ways, my father, but he was so different on the cruise. He was so relaxed and gregarious, and everyone just loved him. And I describe in the book how in the bar, in one of the ship bars, there would be a sort of gaggle of people who would gather at cocktail time, and my father would have a martini and start talking about his youth, the 1930s, the 1940s, and people would sit around rapt, and he would be asking making requests from the pianist at the bar and singing these, great American songbook classics from his youth. And it just showed me a side of him, which in a poignant way, I thought if he had had a slightly different kind of life with maybe a slightly different beginning, not during the Great Depression when his family and so many families suffered so badly, he would have been a much more relaxed kind of a person. And I felt like going on this, which, so to come back to something Gordon said before, is the Odyssey reading me, or am I reading the Odyssey? It seemed so perfect that during the cruise, which in the structure of the book corresponds to the part of the Odyssey which is about the adventures of Odysseus on the high seas, that I would have had this sort of Odyssean experience of seeing things I had never seen before, which is what Odysseus gets to do when he's on his madcap journey through the Mediterranean, and also, there's this thing in the Odyssey, a kind of a motif in the epic, I mean, not my book, about transformations, people being transformed. Athena waves her magic wand and suddenly Odysseus looks better and handsomer and whatever. And I felt that when I was watching my father have this kind of transformation, let's call it, I suddenly understood that part of the Odyssey, which it's not actually magic. It's just that in the right set of circumstances, a side of a person can emerge that makes them actually seem different. So I felt, to add to your question about what I learned about my father, I also understood things about the Odyssey because of this experience, and what some of these elements of the Odyssey could mean and how we could interpret them, Yeah.
Wow. So I have one more question for you, Daniel, before you open it up to our audience, which is, what do you hope that people take away from your writing, An Odyssey and Three Rings?
Well, I mean, I'm always, my as America's explainer of the classics, I always hope that people can see why these works are so exciting. I always hate the word relevant. That sounds like medicine. But it's just they're so exciting to think. First of all, they're a lot of fun. I mean, there's a reason that the Odyssey is the text they give you in high school rather than the Iliad, because whatever else it is, it's an incredible adventure story, and it's a great romance. It is about a man who is desperately trying to get home to his family. Go turn on the TV. That's a plot that never goes away, right? And so I always hope that people, after reading, whether they're my books where I always somehow work the classics in, or my essays, I'm always talking about why these things are really fun to think about when we try to think about our own world and the lives that we lead in it.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, I certainly had a lot of fun reading An Odyssey, and Three Rings was quite interesting as well. So,
Thank you.
so Daniel, let's see if we have any questions for you from our lovely audience here. So Holly has a question for you. Daniel, if you were writing a review of Circe, what points would you make? I know you reviewed Miller's book, The Song of Achilles.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I can't know until I write the review, which I'm not going to do. But, I think in considering a book like The Song of Achilles or Circe, I've written very often about books, also movies, that take off from the classics. So at the one level, I always think, well, what is this book trying to do by using the classics as a kind of background? Is it a legitimate use of the classics? Does it sort of honor the original in some way? These are the things that come up. But in the case of a novel, the point is not, is it, say, accurate, right? Because it's a novel. But I do think you can worry in a review of a book that takes off from the classics about whether it's sort of true to the spirit of the classics, if not the letter, so to speak. Is it an interesting use of the classics? I'll take as a sort of comparison so one of my great mentors was the novelist Mary Renault, who was very prolific in the 50s through the late 70s as an author of historical fiction based on ancient history. And so I learned a lot from her about, how do you make this very remote world? One of the main questions that always comes up in any kind of work of historical fiction or reimagining the ancient past is it successful in making it feel real? You know, and that's a kind of a hard category to talk about, but, you know, it's like, you know, you don't, because we have absorbed the actual ancient models, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Greek tragedy, blah, 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 you know, how do they talk? Dialogue is always very hard in these novels because on the one hand, you don't want it to sound fakey and archaic, right? And make them talk in some phony way. You know, the way how I'm always amused in these historical epics, how they always give the ancient Greeks and Romans British accents, whether they're British or not, because somehow we think that's, you know, fancier. Like no one in the ancient world had an American accent, apparently. So how did the dialogue, I think, is always the hardest part in books like that. Because on the one hand, you don't want them sounding fake and cardboardy. On the other hand, if it sounds too contemporary, it becomes jarring in a different way. You know, you don't want Achilles to go say to his boyfriend Patroclus, you know, you want to Netflix and chill or whatever. You know, it's just, so you have to tread a very fine line. I remember there's a wonderful English novel a novelist whom I admire very much called Pat Barker, who has recently been writing a series of novels based on the Trojan War, actually. And it's a very hard thing to bring across, to get these people to talk in a way that you're willing to believe. So that's one of the main things I look at, you know. But it's hard. I also don't want to, you know, I never try to impose a kind of absolute template of expectations, you know, because novels are living things, you know. So a novel might get something right and might do something else that's not great, but you have to evaluate the thing on the whole. So I wasn't a huge fan of the Song of Achilles, as I recall. But I remember there were things in it that I thought were great. You know, I remember that she does this thing. So there's one of the characters is Thetis, the sea nymph, who's the mother of Achilles, the great hero of the Trojan War. And she's associated with water. And I remember that she talks with this sort of slightly gravelly tone of voice, as if, you know, like water running over pebbles. And I remember being very struck by what a great thought that was, you know. So everything is a mixed bag. You know, very few people do a perfect. I only read the beginning of Circe, and it's not because I didn't want to keep going, but I've always got insane amounts of reading to do for other things. But I thought it was very clever the way that she, you know, approaches the material and gives you the backstory of Circe and her relationship to the sun and Medea and, you know, the whole family tree, which she obviously researched very thoroughly. So I thought it was, you know, in as much as I read it, I thought it was quite successful.
Daniel, what is next for you? What do we have to look forward to in terms of your work?
Well, I actually am just turning in a new translation of the Odyssey, which I've been working on since the beginning of 2018. So that's been a huge project, and that will come out next, I think, February, about a year from now, from University of Chicago Press. So I've been working on very little besides that, because it is a gigantic undertaking to translate one of these epics, not just because of the size, I hasten to add, but, you know, there are, just to give you an example, you know, when you come at it as a classicist, you know, there are literally there's an entire book written about one adjective in the first book of the Odyssey. So you have to read that book. You know, there are certain words that are very controversial. People aren't exactly sure. There's a thing in classics called a hapax. A hapax refers to a word that only occurs once in all of Greek. And so you can sort of guess what it means by context, but there are sometimes hot controversies about what some of these words. So to be able to translate, the reason I'm saying this is to be able to translate the Odyssey is not just a matter of sitting down with the Greek text, your computer, and a dictionary. You know, there are huge amounts of research to be done, virtually behind every word. And you have to absorb all that before you even begin. And there are raging controversies that some people know about because there was a translation about 8 years ago by Emily Wilson, who was one of the few women who have translated the Odyssey, and she focused a lot on a kind of feminist approach to the material, the treatment of the female characters. So, you have to absorb all of this kind of thing in order to sit down and decide what you think it means. So that I began, as I said, in January of 2018, and I finished the translation last year, and I've just been working on the notes and commentary and introduction for the past year, and I'm actually have to turn the whole thing in at the end of March. So after that, I'm just going to take a vacation. I have an idea for something beyond that, but I think I need to relax a little and take a break.
That sounds great, Daniel. Thank you. We have a couple more questions for you. Kathleen has a question, which is a little broad, so maybe we can decipher. Or Kathleen, you can specify further. Her question is, can you talk a little more about the uncertainty in An Odyssey?
Well, it's a fascinating question. I'd be interested to know a little more from Kathleen about what she means by uncertainty. I think I may know what she's talking about, but Kathleen, can you type a little more in about what you were referring to?
Yeah, I'm curious. We're a little uncertain about this
We're
uncertainty
uncertain about the
question.
uncertainty question. While you're doing that, I'll address another question that I see from Wesley about how I became interested in the classics, given my background, which refers to the fact that my father was a scientist and I went full on into classical humanities studies. Well, that's true. But one of the great things about my father was that he was very much of a humanities guy as well. I mean, professionally, he was a research mathematician for an aerospace corporation, but he was a very big reader. He himself had been an excellent Latin student in high school. I talk about this in the book. And so and my mother was also was a creative person and a big reader, also very interested in the arts, both of my parents. So we were encouraged to pursue our intellectual interests. I always like to say I'm the only Jewish kid from Long Island who, when he announced to his parents that he wanted to major in Greek, they were happy, you know. So I always give a lot of credit to my parents because they never said, what are you going to do with that? They never said, how are you going to get a job? I think they really encouraged us to follow our interests. And my father is very interested in music. He taught himself how to play a number of interests. He encouraged us. We all had to play instruments. He encouraged us to be interested in all kinds of music, classical, jazz, So he's a person of many. He wrote lyrics with a friend of his at work, who they were a songwriting team. So, I do credit him and my mom with really encouraging us. So it looks like a paradox, but actually we were hugely encouraged, by our parents to pursue these things. So do we have a little explication from Kathy?
Yes. Your father mentioned uncertainty in your class, and then it came up near the end of the book, also reflecting your father's life.
Right. Okay. I see. I see. Well, so yes, so that's a sort of a theme of the book, which is that my father professionally worked on this principle of uncertainty, a mathematical principle, uh, in his working life. He and my godfather, actually his closest friend, sort of figured out. But it becomes a theme of the book, I think, because a lot of the book, my book, is about uncertainty in the sense that, what, and again, it's the Odyssey in question, right? What can you actually know about someone? So much of the book is my thinking. I knew for certain who my father was, what his past was, why he was the way he was. And it turned out I was wrong. A lot of all of my books are the story of how I was wrong about everything, actually. And so I think that, and I think it's an Odyssean element, the the way that we're haunted about uncertainty. One of the climax of the Odyssey is that it's very interesting for those of you, and I know there's a lot of teachers out there who have taught the Odyssey, you know, when Penelope decides she's going to finally marry someone towards the end of book 20. And then she has the famous contest of the bow, whoever can string this bow and shoot an arrow through these axe heads that have been lined up in a row. But the point is not that the only the only person who can do that is Odysseus. It's not like the glass slipper. It's that someone who can do that will be as good as Odysseus. Like she'll marry someone who will be as good as Odysseus. She'll never know if it is Odysseus. And there's a lot that's been also written about the end of the Odyssey, about whether you can really be certain that this is the guy who says he is. As many of you know, there have been many riffs over the years on this story, about men coming home from war and they have to come back to the family, but it's not clear that they are who they say they are. So that uncertainty principle, let's call it, haunts, I think, the Odyssey and my own relationship with my father. And that's why I put it in there.
All right. Wonderful. Well, we're reaching the close of our conversation. Daniel, I would just like to thank you for spending time with us this afternoon on this lovely day.
Absolutely a pleasure. I'm very grateful that you invited me, and I'm very happy if people have read the book or want to read the book, and I'm always happy to continue the conversation. This is a different kind of book from a lot of books that you can write because it's so twined up with my father, and I feel that it keeps him in the room in a funny way, even though he's been gone now over 10 years. I love having these conversations because I do feel, someone once asked me when I turned in the manuscript, actually, was it hard for you writing and having to think about your father all the time? I said, no, it was great. It was like a very happy haunting, so it's nice for me to be able to do this because it is a way of keeping him in the conversation. And I think that's really nice.
Yes.
Does seem like that's
And
a unique book. But like I was saying before we started, I would love to see a book that you do on the Iliad, just because I learned so much from An Odyssey about the Iliad, but about your father and about fathers and sons. I know you probably don't have another family member or something to intertwine with that, but I just think your comments are so illuminating. I would love to see something on the Iliad. I know it's a very different thing, but
It is a different thing. And, I hate to disappoint you, but I will. Um, famously among classicists, you're either an Odyssey person or an Iliad person. And it's a temperamental thing. I wouldn't dare to write about the Iliad. I've taught it. I know it. But I don't think I can do that. But I'm open to other suggestions.
well, thank you again, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. What a beautiful way to kick off our big read. If you want to learn more information and attend all of our other Big Read programs, hopefully, please visit penningtonlibrary.org/2024 Big Read. All right. Now, everyone, enjoy your day. Have a wonderful
Thank
time out there. The
you.
weather is beautiful today. Thank you. Good
Bye,
afternoon, everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, Kim.